Well, it just occurred to me that after a difficult discussion about nationalism, and we're still in the internationalism phase, that and everybody's talking about 68, both because it's being in New York remembered because of the Columbia strike, and in in France because of the coincidence of a social crisis. And then it occurred to me that there are all of these waves of revolution. That's really an important aspect of our study. That what we're looking for as future historians is to see how it could happen internationally in a planetary way. How the Eros effect, or whatever else you want to call it, could enable revolutionary movements to join up, to imitate each other, and to spread across the globe. So I just threw down on the paper the obvious dates of 1848, the springtime of nations. Then it spread out to some 60 nations because it went to Latin America and so on. And then the other dates, but one that I let out, forgot, was the revolutions of 1979, or that period, which includes the Nicaraguan Revolution, in which both Fred and I were, to a certain extent, observer participants, and of course the Iranian Revolution, which was in a big country and a very profound one. Hello.
Hello, Richard.
We're just getting into our subject, which is international waves of revolution, and the fact that I left out, in a rush to send out an agenda of some kind, that 1997, around that time, there was what?
79.
79, I got the things.
Don't forget, Richard, don't forget 1980 is part of that.
Yes. Well, go ahead. And
well, the obvious outbreak in Poland in 1980,
yes.
which was part of the same thing in some ways, although different than others.
Right.
And then there are a whole series of revolutions in the Far East, in the Philippines, and in South Korea, which George Katsiafikis, who did, to my mind, still the best book on 1968, devoted two enormous, detailed, well-written, documented studies to. And I'm going to try and invite him, since he's sympathetic to this project, to join us, because Fred and I, when we discovered this, said, let's continue this discussion in 2 weeks by looking at those 1979, 1980 revolutions. So why don't you, for example, present something on Czechoslovakia, and on Poland, and you, Alexei, as well, and we'll go on from there. So, Alexei, the calendar in Russia is a very different one. The important years, when are the years when you became active and when you and Julia were part of the movement?
No, in Russian history, there were a lot of revolutions and uprisings, and our generation joined this movement during the so-called perestroika years under Gorbachev. The perestroika was a process of reforms from above in order to reconstruct the existing system, to overcome a crisis and give the new impetus to this system of the Communist Party rule. But perestroika very quickly generated the process from below. And the reforms, they grew into the popular revolution, in fact, because all features, characteristic features of revolution were present. It's mass manifestations, meetings, strikes, wave of general strikes in coal mining regions and in other districts and branches. And people, they demanded, first of all, political freedom, and secondly, social justice. Very simple slogans. Against the ruling nomenclatura class, against the exploitation, against the dictatorship. And these two slogans, they are still very important now. They are significant now. And the same slogans actually motivated people during the last wave of protest movement in 2011, 2012, when people went in order to protest against Putin's regime, authoritarian regime, and against the rule of these oligarchs and people who generated great wealth in their hands, wealth stolen from people. And the main slogan of this recent protest was against crooks and thieves. Thieves because they thieves in two aspects. First, they took power from people and they took wealth from people. So the same motivation, justice and freedom. And this movement is developing, though very unevenly. But it's another question which we also can discuss later.
So would you then see the 2012 or 2011, 2012, when we were very enthusiastic about the crowds and so on, as in any way related to the Arab Spring, the movement of the squares, Occupy Wall Street and such?
Of course, it was an international phenomenon, and people were conscious about that. And they saw themselves as a part of this development. You see, there was a stereotype, basically a racist stereotype, that there are Western peoples who deserve democracy, freedom, and so on. And there are Eastern people, like Arabs, like Russians also, Russians somewhere between Arabs and Westerners. So you see, for Arabs it's natural to be under Asiatic dictatorship, and for Russians it's a kind of bureaucratic Tsarism. Yes, but Arab Spring and Russian protest movement, they actually went against this stereotype. And the people, the same people as everywhere. Everywhere the same demands. Everywhere the same necessities for society. Two basic things: political freedom and social justice. In Arab world, in Russian world, as well as Western Europe and North America.
Well, you know, I believe that I was at a Moscow seminar, an international meeting of praxis in that year of 2011, correct? And I was very enthusiastic about the Arab Spring. And I had already had contact with people in Morocco and so on. And I tried to share my enthusiasm and to say that this was new and important. But as I remember, my presentation was not at all well received, because partly there was precisely not exactly what you just mentioned, but another kind of sort of racist thing I think that Putin was very scared of these movements, and that the government presented them as dangerous and, subversive and Arab, ways that the Muslims were going to take over, because of course the Chechenian war and the so-called Chechen terrorism was always present. And just as in the United States, there's the stereotype of the Arab as the terrorist, the same was true in Russia. So that's why I asked whether the internationalism eventually broke through.
Yes, and there was a constant theme of the Russian state propaganda that all these events, revolutionary events in the Arab world, the Arab Spring, all were produced by Western imperialists.
Right.
And this was nothing else than the conspiracy against the sovereignty of these Arab dictatorships. And another subject, another theme is that the inevitable result of all democratic revolutions in Arab world would be ISIS. Because Arabs, they are Muslims and they would like to live under Sharia, and all this will end in fundamentalist nightmare. The same in Russia. Putin says if the democratic revolution will win, the result would be Russian fascists takeover. Absolutely propagandistic conceptions. No reasons to believe in them. But these propagandistic conceptions, they are quite influential and they can influence people. And another thing which is very important, that not only people who were on the streets of Moscow and other cities understood the link between their protests and the situation abroad and the mass movement abroad, but also the authorities were and are conscious about that. Why Putin did intervene in Syria? What geopolitical reasons it had? Nobody understands. Putin says that we are fighting terrorists and so on. Why? Why in Syria? The answer is very simple. He understands that the destruction of dictatorial regimes endanger his own positions. When Assad is overthrown, the next probably would be Putin. And for him, it's very sensitive thing to defend dictatorship everywhere, against people everywhere, like in the period of the revolution of 1848, when Russia under Nicholas I was a gendarme of Europe, to defend so-called legal order everywhere, legitimate monarchies. Now it's the sovereign states and the sovereign dictators. There is an international of dictators, and the only response to these international dictators could be and should be the international of peoples.
Yeah, Alexei.
Wow.
When I wrote my article on Ukraine, I had a footnote talking about Putin as Metternich.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And here says the continuity. They say that they are continuing this line of sustaining stability in Europe against subversive movements. They see themselves as continuators of czars and general secretaries.
So would you say that that accounts for the affinities that people perceive between our great leader, Donald Trump, and Mr. Putin?
Yes, psychologically, I think they have some similarities, and the absence of you see values. Putin has no ideology. Trump, I think, has no ideology. And they only, what they want is to maintain power and boast themselves. and to serve their circles of wealthy and other people around them. That's all.
Crony capitalism, in other words.
Yeah.
Well, we have on the one hand an international of crony capitalists, and the other hand, the international of peoples and of working people. But the problem is that the crony capitalists like to fight among themselves. They get together whenever it's a question of democracy coming up from below, they can be depended upon. And I'm just wondering, I'm making this up, but it's always occurred to me that Syria is a place where 2 or 3 global imperialist powers, you know, Russia and the United States, and then the regional powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and their sub-powers.
Turkey.
What? And Turkey, right? They're all going in there to help stamp out the little flame of democracy that was started in 2011. And the way that it looks to my somewhat childish mind is that it's some sort of great war game where all of these players, they get different pieces of bombs and guns and gas, and whoever kills the most civilians, destroys the most hospitals and children, they win. That seems to me as consistent an explanation of what's happening there as anything else. It's horror.
Yes, but I think the decisive factor, nevertheless, is the struggle of Syrian peoples themselves, not an intervention from abroad, but their own revolutionary process. And the Syrian situation and the situation in the Middle East and the situation in Russia should be judged not from the abstract viewpoint of geopolitics, but from the point of view of people who are suffering, people who are victims, people who are fighting for their rights and freedoms. And these people, they deserve support and protection from the international forces. If, let's take, for instance, Spain in the 1930s. The policy of non-intervention was thoroughly reactionary. People deserve support and protection. Nevertheless, who does that? And people in process of revolution, then they have an opportunity to use inter-imperialist contradictions. For instance, I think that Kurds are absolutely right to use US support because they're fighting for the just cause. And let's judge the situation from the viewpoint of the subject of the revolution, not from the point of view of this struggle between great powers. It's a secondary question.
I agree with you completely, Alexei, but my point was not aimed perhaps at what you think. What strikes me is that there is no great power that is prepared to overthrow the Assad regime. Bush was happy to overthrow, and they were happy to overthrow in Libya, but all of these are what I'm saying is all of these imperialist powers are happy to do what Putin wants to do, is to make sure that a tyrant remains and that a bad example is not set for revolution from below. So I wasn't thinking so much of their fighting each other, which they are. It's very contradictory and dialectical. They're fighting each other, yes, because Putin wants a base and this one wants influence, and they're fighting each other's influence. But basically, they're all keeping Assad in power and all destroying the people's movement and turning it into something different.
Exactly, because it's absolutely obvious that if Trump wanted to topple Assad, he would do it very quickly and simply. He's not just interested in that.
And Obama neither.
Yeah. another aspect of the intervention of the United States has been to prevent the rebels, not so much, I mean, the revolutionaries who were fighting Assad, prevent them from receiving or obtaining surface-to-air missiles. That's been a major preoccupation of the CIA, is to keep surface-to-air missiles out of the hands of the rebels so that they would not be able to effectively defend themselves against Putin and Assad's air forces. So yeah, I agree with most of what Richard and Alexei pointed out. I'd also say that, going back to a previous wave of revolutions, after 1979, the United States instigated to some extent the attack on Iran by Iraq, by Saddam Hussein, and provided arms and aid and enabled, but the aim was not directly to overthrow, well, I mean, in that case, the aim perhaps was to overthrow the Iranian regime and restore the Shah, but that was not high on the agenda because it wasn't realistic. But it was more to bleed the revolution and to force it into devoting so many resources to defending itself against Iraq, and then to keep a war going for years between Iraq and Iran, and sort of enable a stalemate that would weaken both those regimes as vis-a-vis U.S. power in the region. But the thing today is that in Syria also is the relative weakening of U.S. standing internationally and the inability of the U.S. to be a regional hegemon any longer, so that the situation redounds to this free-for-all between a number of outside powers that, all of which, as Richard and Alexei pointed out, have their own interests and local clients and so on, but none of which are interested in seeing the Assad regime fall.
And we should not forget also the movement against Iranian fundamentalist regime inside Iran. Right. I think this was one of the main reasons for Iranian ayatollahs try to intervene abroad. Yes. Small victorious war, as it's called. The same reason why Putin intervened in Ukraine and then in Syria, in order to shift the agenda, in order to consolidate support and marginalize democratic opposition. In Iran, the same as in Russia.
Sam, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to talk. The strategy of bleeding your enemies is a long-based one for the United States. If you look at the Vietnam War, my analysis of that is that more than anything else, it was a bleeding exercise to deter revolutionary movements in other countries, like Indonesia and stuff like that, by simply saying, and all through Latin America, by saying, you do that and we're going to make your country into a bloodbath. And in many ways, I think it was fairly successful. I think it really did weaken that whole strand of movements in the 60s and early 70s.
I think it's really interesting too, because when the Iranian, you had a cycle of proletarian revolutions there, right? In Vietnam and Cuba and China, sorry. And it seems to me that the Iranian revolution is quite singular because, while there were socialistic influences, it's easy to forget that, I forget the exact figure, but that the Iranian revolution established the first theocracy that existed, I think, in, a century or more, right? As a global form of governance. Probably that status is a little bit ambiguous, but, and we see this as being, if you think of, kind of this postmodern religious revivalism, right? Just if you have, and this is after 67, right? With the 6 Days War, then you have this dramatic Wahhabism that kind of sweeps over the Middle East, Hindu nationalism, the moral majority in America. We see this all over the world. And I think it's very, very important that we try to think, that change right? And its kind of historical and material basis as well, and why there was this end to the cycle of proletarian revolutions, and why you had this pervasive religiosity that began to install itself.
Except obviously I would disagree with seeing that cycle as proletarian revolutions. They weren't. I mean, the Vietnam movement was anything but a proletarian revolution, for example. It was based in the countryside with some support in the cities, but certainly not around an organized working class in any real meaning of the term. The Chinese essentially stopped being a proletarian revolution somewhere around 1929 because of the stuff I was talking about, and became a guerrilla movement, which is to say a top-down military movement with openness to communities of certain kinds, based in the countryside, and that the Iranian Revolution, I don't have a full understanding of it. I mean, clearly it was a case of, in many ways, a proletarian revolution, which was defeated by the theocracy. And notably, there was not at that point a huge attack on Iran of the kind that there was on Syria. In the recent years, they let it rule because they were afraid of the alternative, which might be a proletarian revolution. They then intervened, as I think Richard said, by helping the Iraqis to make war on Iran.
Yep.
But that's very different from challenging the power again over the proletariat.
Of course. Yeah, when I said proletarian revolution, I was just speaking abstractly. I meant kind of Marxist and universalist in orientation. That was all.
I would call it state capitalist, but
sure.
David had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, I've been listening patiently. I agree with a lot. I don't agree with some. I've expressed my views on the listserv regarding Syria. I would say that, first of all, given the anniversary we're observing, Martin Luther King made a statement that the U.S. was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. I think that is still true. And as an American and as a Jewish American, I feel a responsibility to, first of all, address the imperialism of my own government and my own ruling class. And that doesn't mean we should not be critical of other sub-imperialisms around the world, and they certainly exist. And I applaud all of the, the movements in these countries for social justice and so forth. I just can't see that the Syrian situation can be taken out of context, out of the U.S. imperial agenda in the Middle East and its allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and so on, who are certainly active in systematic human rights violations, ongoing violation. I think everyone agrees with that. And just a little historical context, I think everyone knows this too. How many bases does the United States have around the world, military bases? I looked it up on Wikipedia. How many bases does Russia have? Now, they listed about a dozen, only one outside the contiguous area of Russia, the former Soviet states, where they have little bases, and that is in Syria. And I think, and actually, if you want to look in the context of international law, this is not a violation of international law for a sovereign government to invite another power to have a military base. And where did the new Cold War start from? I'm very persuaded by Richard Cohn's analysis in the nation, and in particular by the memo of Baker when Gorbachev made the deal to reunify Germany. And the commitment, which Baker said, is we're not going to expand NATO. We pledged not to expand NATO. And of course, they reneged on that and then started expanding bases all around Russia. So I think all I'm saying is we need to add this to the context of our analysis. That's the point. We need to add this to the context of analysis and also inform our own political agenda here in the United States. Particularly, I mean, and I don't want to belabor this, but I was happy to join Code Pink in invading the Kennedy Center about a month ago, where we protested the Saudi prince. And none of us got arrested, amazingly. But this is the kind of action I think that American anti-imperialists should be, first of all, concerned about. What is the agency of our own imperialist power and how we can strengthen movements to check it. And so that's my, for now, that's all I want to say.
Yeah. David, I don't totally disagree with you, but...
Not totally?
I mean, I'm heavily in agreement. Obviously, empirically, you're right.
Yeah.
But to expect imperialists, whether the U.S. or Russia or whatever, not to act as imperialists is a mistake. You know, now we focus, you know, like yesterday I led a demonstration of JVP in the streets of New Brunswick. You know, this is what we do. But when we're trying to analyze things, we need to take what I see as a broader perspective, which is to focus in on our side and how they are responding to our side, which is what I think most of what we've been doing. So that, you know, the discussion of Putin is in some ways because he's the intellectual leader of all the imperialists right now. And I think Alexei or somebody pointed it out, that the U.S. in many ways is at this stage following his playbook. I think it would be useful, and I put this into the chat, that we might want to discuss the question of why the French '68 movement didn't lead us into a socialist world, which it potentially could have done given a whole lot of ifs that didn't come to play. And that understanding that is part of the process of writing what we're supposed to be writing.
I'm willing to take up that challenge because that was what I tried to explain in the article that I deposited in the Dropbox, which is called 1968 in Historical and International Context. And the phrase that I came up with is called in French décalage, which unfortunately translates jet lag. But what it means is there are two historical time systems that don't quite coincide. So that, unfortunately, when in 1989, the system around Russia and the so-called satellite nations finally ripened up and collapsed, instead of joining a world where there was democracy and support for what Alexei was talking about, poor Russia fell from the frying pan into the fire, and instead of being greeted by people like Cady Wolf and the rest of us new leftists who were opposed to state capitalism and private capitalism and who understood what they were fighting for, they fell into the hands of the Thatcherites. And so Germany was reunited on the basis of total triumph of capital taking over what, from an industrial point of view, had not been a real failure in East Germany. It was about 10 or 12% less productive than the West. But the products were kind of shoddy sometimes, but it was still very much a functioning state capitalist economy. But I'm deviating from my point. My point is that there was this big gap between 1968 and 1988, when the dream of the Czech Prague Spring finally was able to spread on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Now, I'm hopeful, and that's part of my hypothesis of Archimedes, is that with internet and social media and much different forms of communication today, that the two movements would not necessarily be separated the way they were when, during the Cold War period, there was very little communication possible. So basically, those are the two answers that I try to come up with. I'm sort of satisfied with the Katsifiakis's Eros theory of a kind of contagion of a thirst for freedom and combat, and people just breaking out of the routines and into another world where human beings start making their own lives and living very, very differently. You know, Mitch Abador today in New York is giving his talk about the book that he put together of interviews of people that had been active in France during May of 1968. And it's an excellent book. Because he interviews people that were in Paris, people that were workers, people that were in the provinces, people that were students, and even a couple of communists. And so you get a real picture of what it was like. And his title, May Made Me, is an incomprehensible pun. The French word faire means to make or to do. So when people in France say, j'ai fait 68, I did 68, they don't really, it doesn't translate as I made 68. But if you say, 68 m'a fait, 68 made me, that makes sense in the other direction. But what runs through most of these interviews, and he's an excellent interviewer, is that they were great moments in the people's lives, and that being empowered and taking power and finding their voices and joining together with others and building and participating in a movement was just the most thrilling thing and left them permanently changed. And they feel left society very much changed, although mostly on a social level rather than economic or political level.
Which leaves the question of how do you make it? so that we transform the society, the politics, and the economy the next time we get a chance. Because ultimately, I think that's what we're trying to write up.
Absolutely.
And, you know, there's been a lot of analyses by every political group in the world of the French May 68. And I'm not going to ever pretend to have read them all, though I've read a fair number of them. And, you know, what I come away from it is that both of the traditions that I tend to relate to have an element of truth in helping us to understand that. On the one hand, coming out of the Marxist humanist tradition, this whole thing that, you know, you need to have an idea of what you're for and how to get there. And that was lacking. And coming out of the old third camp IS kind of position in the United States, it's something that actually goes back to Lenin's theory to some extent, although reframed, which is that there are activists all over the working class and they need to be organized in some form, preferably a core of them in advance of the outbreak, if possible, so that you'll be in a position so that some of those ideas can be implemented rather than, you know, drowned out by the theocrats or whoever. And it's, you know, being able to build along both those lines strikes me as what's going to be needed for us to ever have the success we need.
Richard has called attention in the chat to the need to try to summarize some of this. And actually, I see Richard now typing more or less what Sam just said. But as you make these points, if you jot down in the chat a little bit of what you said, so just as kind of an aide-memoire for us as we try to summarize and pull this together, that would be a big help. So that's just a housekeeping note.
I think we should, whenever somebody comes up with something that sounds like a conclusion or a parameter or something that will be, thank you very much, Sam, for reminding us of that. Just keep typing it in as it comes up.
I'm typing, I'm just not able to drop them in the chat. I will send them right away to Fred, and then you can edit.
Great, thank you, Anna.
Oh,
yeah.
Great. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Anna. Well, you know, the question that Sam has asked is the essential one for us. And I wish Matti were here. I wrote to him and asked him to come to present what we tried to do in North Africa in 2011, because we were active and we followed closely all the events, and what we thought was really needed was to have some kind of face-to-face conference of the activists from various countries, that the internationalism that was implicit in the movement that jumped from Tunisia to Egypt and then across all over, that these people, if we could bring them together and create a network and the embryo of an organization, that would be the best thing we could do. And we tried. We got some money together. We tried to get together with other groups. We tried to find a place either in Tunisia or in Morocco to hold a conference, but it was beyond our very small means, basically our networks. And so we spent a lot of time and energy on it, but it didn't come about. One of the reasons is that travel across North Africa is not that easy if you can't take an airplane, which is expensive, because the countries are all squabbling with each other. Morocco, the border between Morocco and Algeria is a mess, and the border between Algeria and Tunisia and so on. And a lot of these people are students or poor working people. So to get them from one place to another, and then all the bureaucratic obstacles and so on, it couldn't happen. But even though I'm supposed to be a big spontaneist and so on, I agree completely with Sam about the importance of the other tradition, as long as it's some sort of democratic network type movement rather than a party. And what got me started on this latest kick was 1997, when I went to South Africa, newly emerged from apartheid, where people from a group called Workers' Organization for a Socialist Alternative, who were people who had come out of the Trotskyist type movements and so on, with whom we had connections. And it was actually through Alexei that our group Praxis in Moscow got invited, and I was sent as our delegate. And the idea of going to South Africa, and it was absolutely great to see the people on the street and the place integrated, and it was just wonderful in the air. Many of the people that attended this conference have been in Robben Island, in the same prison camp as Nelson Mandela, with whom they argued because of him being influenced by the Stalinists. And they were mainly people from all over the Southern Hemisphere. And it seemed to me so wonderful, with the world upside down, and calling for the creation of a network rather than a party. And so I went there full of enthusiasm, and I said, well, what can I contribute? Because these people were all part of organizations. So I brought some stuff about Victor Serge, which was very well received, and I wrote up a paper, which was called The Archimedes Hypothesis. Actually, the title was A Triple Vision, but it had that idea that was really inspired by what we were doing, which is if you can have the center anywhere in the globe, rather than it must be in Paris or Moscow or New York, and you can have people connected via internet and so on, that it's no longer the same world. And that internationalism of a new kind is possible. And I've been basically flogging that idea for 20 years, and it's part of what's behind this idea of future historians. But so far, I think we need to imagine some kind of organization coming together like that. What would that look like? How could that happen? There's a real task for us as future historians.
David just made an important point in the chat, which I wish you would elaborate on, about BDS as an example of an international or global networked movement that doesn't have a top-down structure or thinking about it myself, just as I speak, that it's something that has developed more or less organically out of a call from people in Palestine. But it's become a very widespread network of activists in many countries, all of which share a common vision and have been, relatively effective, and at least in bringing the issue to the fore, if not actually achieving boycotts and sanctions in reality. David, what do you have to say about that?
Thank you. Actually, I just posted on the Future Historian listserv a real interesting article about a movement I was completely unaware of in Israel, which is called Standing Together. And this is an initiative of young people, apparently initiated by some members of the Israeli Communist Party, Hadash, who are represented in the joint list, which are now the Israeli government is bringing repression down on even on the elected members of their parliament. But I think it's important to emphasize, as Fred did, this is actually grew out of Palestinian civil society. It wasn't the PLO or the Palestinian Authority that initiated this, and only very recently, actually, an official of the PA actually made some overtures to say maybe we should think about a one-state solution. By the way, which is not on the agenda of BDS. It leaves the question open. Of course, it seems that is the only solution that is possible for just a peace in that resolution of that conflict. And the fact that it's nonviolent, I think, speaks volumes to the kind of internationalism we need and we need to promote around the world. So it is increasingly powerful. And by the way, my own candidacy for council at large, I'm going to have my palm cards ready pretty soon. It's already on my website. I support BDS publicly, and I also call for the termination of the relationship between the DC police and the Israeli repressive apparatus. There's a long history of training, a militarization of U.S. police, which actually has collaborated with the Israelis, and groups all over the U.S. are pointing a finger at this, and actually the first community, what was it? Durham just officially terminated its relationship with the Israeli police, the first city in the whole country. So I'll just say, I'm so impressed with the young activists that are reinventing and rethinking political struggle. And that was the post I shared regarding Standing Together, because the official parties on the left, and I'm talking about the real left, not the Labor Party of Israel, the real left wing that resists the Israeli policies don't have a old-fashioned conception of political struggle. And this is the Standing Together, actually, and as Richard mentioned, they're connecting people with the social media and as an ongoing active movement, instead of, sporadically protesting and then going back home, but actually producing some continuity, which is what we need, not only in this struggle, but of course, above all, with climate justice all over the world. So,
yeah.
Okay, I'm shutting my mic.
I see Sam Fassbender has joined us. Sam, we're talking about global revolutionary upsurges at different moments, 1979, 1968, 1848. So where do we go from here?
Don't really know. Generally speaking, some kind of uprising is probably going to be tied in some way to the way things are, pretty much, that you know, the some kind of, you know, material point in the development of the capitalist system that allows for it or makes it more possible than it was in other times. And beyond that, I don't really know a whole lot. Still kind of studying it.
Richard.
Well, just to rephrase the question, as it was rephrased before, assuming that 2011 was not the last wave of revolutions, the question that was posed most acutely by Sam is, what can we do, or what can we even imagine doing, so that the next time something like this comes around, we'll be more prepared, and that some sort of organization, coordination, other than just sympathy, would come out of it. And I think the next thing was that the BDS was brought up as an example of an international solidarity movement. That, and I wonder if there are other such examples, either historical or contemporary.
Well, there have been thousands of international solidarity movements. For example, against apartheid in South Africa, which more so than the current BDS movement also included a certain degree of organized working class participation in terms of, you know, blocking stuff from going through ports and stuff like that. For all the weaknesses of that, it's still at least there. And you know, the movement to prevent and to stop the attacks on Russia in 1918 was internationalism. You know, we could go on and on and on about this.
Right.
But the question of how we actually begin to organize it and can conceptualize it and can help it to grow, particularly as a bunch of relatively disconnected intellectuals, you know, is always a tricky question.
Yeah, the question of who we are is a little fraught here and a little ambiguous, because on the one hand, when we pose questions like what can we do to be ready for the next upsurge or whatever, the we is a general and collective we of the global radical left. It's not we 7 or 8 people online on Sunday morning. On the other hand, when Richard poses the question, what can we even imagine doing? That's up to us, and it's something we can do. We can imagine something, and we can put it out there as something that others can join us in imagining and in beginning to shape. That might bring us to our Richard's and my suggestion for what we actually do at Left Forum this year, which we had talked earlier in earlier sessions about doing something to present the Future Historians Project. So Richard had a good idea of something that would be probably both effective and simple for us to do. You want to talk more about that, Richard?
Oh, okay. Well, it just occurred to me that we should try. Fred was able to download the application. Does anyone know what the deadline is? Not that they
May 1st.
Okay, well, let's see if we can get it in by May 1st and then change it later if we need to, because you can always change those things. But what we want is to do rather a round table, it seems to me, and where the main subject is what our project is, what our perspectives are, what we've been able to achieve, and basically to reach out to people to join us, and particularly in the areas where we haven't been able to do much, which is the fiction writing, the transforming of our insights and our conclusions and our visions from bare outlines or ideas into something that would fill up all of those little boxes in the grid that Fred and I have made, if that's the way we want to go. But in any case, that's where we've gotten so far. One of the ideas that we had, since we were trying to reach out to science fiction people, was to invite Kim Stanley Robinson to join our roundtable. So I wrote to him yesterday, and because our ideas are very close, and it would certainly attract people to the seminar. And I'm just thinking if there are other such people, but what we want to do, I think we're supposed to have 5 people. I don't know why they say they limit it to 5. Actually, they don't limit it to 5. They suggest, but they're thinking of a traditional panel where each gets 10 minutes and then there's discussion and going back and forth, whereas a round table is something a bit different. So what we'd like is 5 volunteers, basically. We are both want to and are required to have a demonstration of our diversity. So we have diversity of gender and diversity of nationality, and hopefully to some extent of age groups.
So operationally, we thought that we could just, and it might be tricky to conform this to the parameters that are set by Left Forum, but to actually have one of our Sunday morning online sessions, and perhaps we could schedule it for the time slot of Sunday at 11 during Left Forum, depending on what they offer us in terms of time. But we would just, have a big screen and a computer and a camera, and anyone who was local would be sitting there in the room, and we would bring any of you online remotely the same way we do every session, and just kind of do it as a demonstration of the kind of conversations that we engage in, but focusing on, as Richard said, the nature of the project itself and what our hopes are for it, and appealing for additional participants.
I would say if Kim comes, although I want him to take part in this way, we might want to give him a little extra airtime.
Yes.
The other thing,
if he's actually willing to come to New York, then absolutely, we could submit a second proposal for him.
yeah,
But Richard and I had a more modest notion that we get a 5 or 10 minute video of him rather than having him join us live. If he's willing to join us live, so much the better. But
Fred?
We're only just now approaching that.
Yeah, I wanted to say another thing on this. I mean, I'll be there at the forum, as I imagine some others will, although I'm on another panel and God only knows if they'll be at the same time. But if it would be helpful, and I will take your guidance on this, I'm not trying to push forward, but I'm perfectly happy to read a poetry piece or two if it'll be helpful.
Yes. Yeah, we can fit that right in.
So the theme of this is related to literature. This is the idea?
Well, no, the theme is our theme, our project as it's been laid out in the start page of the wiki and other documentation that we've developed. Just presenting to the broader left public what we're doing and what we're engaged in, where we hope it will go.
The room in which it's being held has got all the modern equipment, Wi-Fi and so on, so that we'll have both a situation like this where we'll all be online, those of us who are not actually present. And we can also put online, maybe by means of a projector or something like that, the basic statements on our wiki. Yeah, like maybe we could have the wiki projected big behind, where it has the whole the introduction, about us and or the homepage, so that people will constantly know what we're doing. And I assume that half of the time will be spent answering questions and talking with the audience, right?
Yep. So we could do something like this. Just hang on. Anyway, you get the idea.
Yes, that's absolutely.
There we go. Yes. So we could switch out from the participants to the wiki and show people what we're doing that way.
And also have it as paper handouts so they can take it home.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, it would be nice to get Stanley Robinson. That would be great.
You could Skype him in, couldn't you?
Yes, that's
yeah, we would just have him join the session. Same here. We just do one more talking head on the Zoom session. Now, I also sent out this morning a link to a podcast that I was listening to of several writers talking about making alternative worlds. And they, in turn, cite a number of works of climate fiction, science fiction that are engaged in this thing. So it's something that's happening out there in the culture that we need to become more attentive to and suss out other individuals that might be interested in working with us in some way. There's a fellow named Jeff Vandermeer who writes for the New York Times and has written several works of speculative fiction around issues of energy and climate. It sounds interesting. So.
Yeah, I saw that, but I didn't quite understand it, and I didn't have time to pursue it. But these are groups similar to ours?
No, they're individuals, but there was a conference at the University of Houston that this is or a symposium that this is a recording of that involves several of these people. And just, it's about an hour-long presentation that you can listen to. But in the course of it, they mention a number of other, works of future fiction of various kinds.
Okay, so these are people that we could send out something like the letter that I sent to Robinson.
Yes, exactly.
Saying who we are and so on. All right, so will you get a hold of those identities?
Yes.
That's great. That's great.
Well, okay. Here are my fictional ideas. I'm not a great, what would you call it? Poser of characterization and of plot. I probably just haven't done the research necessary to be a fiction writer. Okay, I'm of course writing a book, but it will be non-fiction. My book will be, that is to say. But I can create science fiction ideas. I can create science fiction possibilities, and hopefully somebody else who's better than I am at this kind of stuff can run with them. Okay, the first one was basically parody, and we would call it Religion in Space, and it's largely parody that wants to take on Star Wars. You have the planet of the angels and the planet of the devils are engaged in a war, and the planet of the devils, they all have mutated into a form that allows them to have red suits, horns, and tails, and they don't really speak English. They just use villainous laughter to communicate. And their war spills over into the war between the planet of the writers of crappy space opera and the planet of the critics of the writers of crappy space opera. And that would be the first plot. I'm going to leave it there pretty much. Then the second plot concerns a future in which people go into hibernation, right? They have these hibernation chambers. They go into hibernation, and this is the way they're going to get to other planets. And a planet with relatively reasonable conditions for human existence has been discovered. It unfortunately orbits an orange sun, okay? And because it orbits an orange sun, for it to have any sort of sophisticated forms of life, it has to be somewhat smaller than Earth, okay, so that it can receive more ultraviolet radiation and other sorts of mutation-producing things. And it will also have more significant tidal forces impacting it, meaning there will be more mountain formation and larger littoral areas and that sort of thing. It will have a thinner atmosphere, and so people will have to get used to living on Denver the rest of their lives. And so anyway, the plot concerns the fact that when they get to this planet after decades of hibernation, because it's going to take quite some time to get to it, and it's going to be at least as far as the sun, the star Epsilon Eridani, which is 11.1 light years away. When they finally get to this planet, they discover that none of the life forms on the planet are edible. And so they have to live off of genetically engineered potatoes that are capable of supplying human beings with all their necessary nutrients. And the plot will concern how to continuously genetically engineer these potatoes so that people can have some kind of food source that will keep them from going stir crazy, right? Because when you have just one thing to eat in your diet. All right, then the third plot would concern world society has finally, it might be too late, decided to mitigate climate change by ramping up solar power and solar panel production.
Sounds like David Schwartzman.
Yeah, most of the world by this point has become socialist, right? Except for the United States, which is in a continuous war with the rest of the world, and is continually run by the shadow government at the Pentagon and in other places. The CIA, the secret teams, the Council on Foreign Relations, and so on. And in these socialist paradises, the people who used to run the oil companies before they were abolished have been sentenced to live in these minimum security prisons. They're very comfortable places, except of course that they are obliged to run the gallium mines so that they can supply the solar ramp up with enough gallium arsenide to continue ramping up solar power. And the plot concerns all of these former petroleum company executives as they get used to the realities of gallium mining and learn new and more sophisticated ways of running their gallium mining operations.
I volunteered to be a labor organizer.
Yeah.
And to agitate for a strike.
Okay, so those are the three plots that I have come up with. Like I said, I'm not really a very good science fiction writer, so y'all gonna have to come up with, you know, character depiction and all that other nice stuff that comes with being a good, you know, science fiction writer. And that. Ask Kim Stanley Robinson if he wants to take on any of these. All right. I'm gonna mute myself and let y'all
his own plots, Kim Stanley Robinson. But Sam, your it was very interesting, your reference of gallium, but that actually brings up a very serious challenge in terms of renewable technologies, because and there's been a great deal of thought about it. The UN just published not too long ago a big report on this issue of the rarer elements that are being needed in a renewable transition. And there are a number of things going on. First of all, there are substitutes being developed that avoid these rare metals. And I think there's a lot of research and development in that area. So, for instance, to produce storage batteries without lead or nickel, which are relatively, toxic and really not good, there is development, using sodium and sulfur, which are very common elements. So that's one direction, and it's also true in wind and for other photovoltaic technologies. So that it's a very serious. I'm glad you mentioned that. The other is that as the renewable infrastructure grows, it can actually facilitate recycling of the rare elements, so there'll be less extractivism. And so that's actually a plus in terms of the renewable technologies. But thanks for mentioning gallium. One of my favorite elements, by the way. It's the only other metal. I have a little sample of gallium, actually. It's the only metal besides mercury that is liquid near room temperature.
Well,
you could actually hold. I have a little bottle of gallium, which you hold in your hand and it melts.
Well, what I wanted to avoid was this standard utopian plot, right, that you see well, for instance, I believe that this is the standard utopian plot used in William Morris's News from Nowhere, right, where you have the new participant in the utopia is being led around the utopia by a tour guide who describes all of the sights and sounds to be seen. I think Ernest Kallenbach in Ecotopia uses this plot too, okay? It's the standard utopian plot, right? You all probably are familiar with it. Okay, so anyway, I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Richard.
Yes, this is very interesting. And I have tried my hand at science with more or less success. Oh, wait a second. I turned off my mute.
We can hear you.
You're muted, Richard.
Now you're muted. You were not muted before.
Now you were just talking low.
Oh.
Now you're fine. We can hear you.
Okay. Fred, could you go right back onto our wiki and click on Billions versus Billionaires, and I'll present my plot for a science fiction, which I've been meaning to share with you for the longest of time, but never got around to it for I don't know what reasons. Okay, can you make it bigger?
No.
Oh, well, that's not too good. But all right. So will you click on it?
Yeah, I'm on Billions versus Billionaires.
Oh, we're there already?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, look, this isn't working, so I'll just do it from memory. All right. What I wrote was a science fiction story about a multiplayer online computer game that takes over the world in the sense that it's it and its thousands of players around the world join together, and actually it turns from a class struggle game, which is an online computer game, into the actual class struggle. And the way it works is this. The story talks about a bunch of people like us who were thinking about utopias and creating visions of a better world. And then they decide to hold an utopias contest and so on. And then it develops that someone decides to turn the ideas into a game. And the game is a class struggle game. We had one not too long ago that was pretty good based on Monopoly called A Class Struggle that Bertel Oldman, the Marxist at NYU, devised, and that actually sold pretty well and got popular. But they couldn't keep going on the money because when it was popular, they didn't have enough to sell, and then it wasn't popular anymore. But to get back to my imaginary game, based a little bit on his, and which I consulted him on, the way it works is that there is a game globe, a virtual globe. And that virtual globe is chronological. It follows all the disasters, all the catastrophes that we've been doing in our Dropbox. All of these things get worse and worse and worse as a clock ticks and the game goes on. And the players consist of various working classes in various places and capitalists, billions versus billionaires. And there is a list of them and what their powers are. And the way the game is organized is that it's a race against the clock. If the billions are able to take over the world and stop the carbon production and the wars and so on from happening, then the game is won. But there are various pitfalls each time that a new game starts. It could be an atomic war, or this is epidemic or that epidemic. In other words, the globe is programmed on the basis of the latest information that's fed to it by all kinds of research. And so the world keeps coming to an end. Sooner or later, if the class war does not lead to resolution. And of course, there could be, like David suggests, movements of a reformist nature which could retard that. So that would plug into it. And various struggles could then retard it. But sooner or later, it will come to the final clash. And so I then try to imagine what happens, which is that the game gets very popular and that the players of the game who are all over the world in game rooms and what do you call them, cyber cafes, get really hooked on the class struggle and get involved with local people. And so that the game structure, the game's links online turn out to be what I've been unable to imagine elsewhere, which is some sort of framework where all of these different struggles come together, where the information gets passed, so that the game itself becomes an idea virus. The young people who are addicted to playing the game become intermediaries between strike groups and citizens groups and so on and so forth. And there's a whole story there, which ends up with a worldwide revolution. So I'd like to have the group discuss it at some time in the future and correct it and add it on to it. The part about it that's most fun is the rules of the game of billions versus billionaires, because it presents a satire of capitalism. Instead of writing furious criticism about the rich get to do this and that and the other thing, it's a very cool-eyed way of presenting classes of people as functions in a game. And so they get to do this and they get to do that. It's like the moves that knights and pawns and can make. So the capitalists are stuck in that they must compete with each other. But at the same time, they've got to, they're in a struggle with their workers. And all the different aspects of life that give them power, that they can control the media, and the various other things, the corruption, all of that is built into the moves that they're allowed to make. And the masses, the billions, they have very, very few moves that they can make. They are rooted where they live. Or if they try to migrate and move, it's very, very difficult for them. They also are limited in time. Their opponents, the billionaires, can wait 10 years to turn around a property, or 20. And they can and if things are not going well, they can put their money in gold and sit out one crisis or another. But the masses, they have to eat every day, which means that they don't have the time and the attention. It's all worked out, but it's presented pedagogically in a way that overcomes our prejudice against didacticism by saying, well, these are the moves of pieces on a game board. And in fact, they're all perfectly logical. So my hope was to build such a game. And with Jenny and Tim, we made various efforts with game designers. But those never came about. But as a fictional game, and as part of our future historians, I'm trying to figure out a way to incorporate it. And that's what I want us to look at very soon.
I'd like to ask Conrad about Ready Player One, which is a novel that my wife has been trying to get me to read for a year or two, and which Steven Spielberg has just made a film of. And I'm wondering if there's anything there in the video game sphere that would be something we could borrow or expand upon, or do a détournement of Ready Player One to turn it in the direction that Richard is discussing.
Sure. Well, I think Ready Player One, in a certain way, is an exceptional film. I think there are a lot of fairly interesting and provocative theoretical ideas in the film, which, very much like the project Richard spoke of, which I have an enthusiasm for as well, deals with the idea that we see more and more the kind of adjoining of the virtual and what we've traditionally described in contrast to the virtual as the real. In our world today, it's impossible to discuss the economy, right, without reference to the virtual. And in fact, there are all kinds of virtual sub-economies in all of this, right? Kind of virtual law enforcement, virtual class struggle, if you will, right? That persists along these lines. Again, I think that what, Ready Player One is directed by Spielberg. It's technically novel, but I also think that we know that Spielberg's political stance is characteristically quite liberal. So while there's a certain promise of the idea of class struggle, right? At the end there is a kind of showdown between the corporate villains in Ready Player One and the masses, who rush to kind of overthrow them. Ultimately, control over this virtual world at the end of Ready Player One is delegated to a small sort of clique of particularly virtuous individuals. Right? So it's not really a mass rule. So you have this kind of liberal narrative evolution. So I think one thing that, and they're strong. I don't explore it in it's not so fictional or ludological in the vein of what Richard's been talking about. In my book, I discuss the present day situation with games, and particularly the idea that we're moving beyond a mode of artistic creation that I think is characteristic of modernity, in which there's a segregation between author and audience, right? That in games today, like Minecraft or World of Warcraft, we see that there's a kind of lateral creation, in which it's impossible to assess these things or engage with them in the same way as traditional art, because almost everyone becomes an author at a certain level. I think Mark said at one point in his work, he said that we can see that when we look at the Greek drama, right, of Aeschylus and Sophocles, etc., that at a certain point it predicts subsequent political changes in Greek society that didn't come to pass until later, right? So my kind of theorization here is that with games, we can actually we have a kind of resource to look at the future, perhaps, of the organization of modes of production in general. I think it would be interesting to engage with Ready Player One, to engage with some of Richard's ideas. I would hope to engage with some of my ideas. I think that would be a really, fascinating dialogue to have as well. So,
Conrad, I'm so glad to hear this, and I invite you to go just right onto the wiki and copy out what I've done, or do it right then and there, and develop it more. On it, but even develop it.
I would like to interject briefly here. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. My experience is that written science fiction is typically far more creative than science fiction that has been developed into any other format. Okay, yes. This was, in my opinion, especially true of the golden age of science fiction, which went through the 1950s and 1960s, and which I would extend into the 1970s to include such works as Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed and a number of others. And so, we had all kinds of brilliant stuff that came out of that era, right? From the best of Heinlein to Ursula K. Le Guin to, Octavia Butler and John Varley and a number of other writers. And what we got on film was Star Trek and Star Wars. Okay, so I think that our search is best conducted if we start with the written stuff, okay? And if there's a particularly interesting movie out there, let's start with the screenplay. I'm sure that that's probably where we can get the best ideas right away.
Yeah, I was actually referencing the novel that Ready Player One is based on, which is also titled Ready Player One. It's written by Cory Doctorow. Again, I haven't read it myself, but I think it would be worth taking a look at that. And I intend to read the novel before I see the movie. So,
Cory Doctorow,
always a good idea, in my opinion.
Yeah. Have you all read Walk Away?
No.
You haven't read Walk Away? Oh, you should read Walk Away. It's one word, Walk Away. WAKLKAWAY. Conrad, have you read Walk Away?
I haven't read Walk Away, no.
Read Walk Away.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I find it, not to quibble too much, but, if you look at the relative importance that's characteristically allotted to science fiction within the history of cinema. It's even greater than in literature. So from Metropolis to Solaris, to Blade Runner to The Matrix, I think it's hard to say that, you know, the supreme expression of science fiction. I think that's a controversial statement, let's say.
Well, I'm
We
sticking
can't
with
have
my
any
guns here.
controversial statements here. Sam, I'm just being silly.
No embargo on controversy, of course.
I mean, you know, what of written science fiction, Conrad, have you read? How familiar are you with, you know, John Varley or Ursula K. Le Guin or, well, you know, any number of these writers? Look, what happens is when the most exciting of these writers gets, you know, appropriated for a movie, and then the concepts in the writing get simplified in the movie, and you end up missing a lot. Okay.
Well, you know, we can read Walter Benjamin too, right? The cinema brings to it certain unique properties, right, that can galvanize an audience in a different way. But we don't need to have this big debate. But just in defense of cinematic science fiction.
I agree with Conrad, actually, and I just thought of Tarkovsky's brilliant film Solaris, not the remake, but the film back in the early 70s, which of course was based on Stanislaw Lem's novel.
Oh, is the movie better than Lem's novel?
I think it added something. Okay. I mean, look, I read the novel when I was actually in the public library in Arlington. I took it out, and that's when I discovered Stanislaw Lem, and I have a whole collection of his stuff. But I think the novel is great, but the film is great too. And it's I saw the original 4-hour version in a little movie theater, which of course is no longer exists in Georgetown, D.C. But I'm wondering if you can find that original version of Solaris somewhere on Netflix. No, probably not Netflix. If anyone knows, it should be shared. I think that was the most brilliant science fiction movie I've ever seen. Well, of course, I'm thinking of, what's his name? Back in the, you know what I'm thinking of.
Didn't
the American one.
Polish.
The American one. Yeah, Stanislaw Lem, of course, he's Polish.
Wrote in Polish. Okay, what are we missing in the translation from Polish to English? That's a question to look at too.
I don't know. I read the novel in English, so I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't read Polish either.
Can I have the floor? I think
Sure, Richard.
am I visible?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because I don't see myself on the little thing. Could you spell, Sam, the name of Varney? Because that's the one of the authors you've evoked that I haven't read.
Oh, Varley? John
Yeah.
Varley? Varley? Varley?
First name?
John.
Yeah, and where should we start reading?
Any of the 8 Worlds stuff. I guess the Ophiuchi hotline, it kind of explains the premise for the rest of them. The short story is brilliant.
Hotline, what?
The Ophiuchi hotline, Ophiuchi, Ophiuchi hotline.
I got it down. Okay, I would just like to return to the focus of they're all different types of science fiction, of course, but we've set parameters for this particular collective writing project, which is that there be no gods and no extraterrestrials. And we later added one, no gulags or one-party states. But that was not an aesthetic. That's all too likely a conclusion. But so that your third plot, Sam, is a perfectly good one for here, but the other two would be ruled out. And the idea of this one is that the things have to be plausible, that they can't be too big jumps in what is familiar to our experience now. That virtual experience and I don't know what you want to call it, material experience, can collide and collude. We're seeing every day. And clearly, the machines that we use, from the pencil to the computer, are extensions of our minds and of our hands, as Marx always said about the tools that help make humans different from other intelligent beasts. But what we want to do is create something that is plausible from that point of view.
Also, I'd like to know if anyone has decided to grant or take up the movie rights for Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, because I really can't think of a science fiction film that deals with the approximate region of Margaret Atwood's trilogy there that is anywhere as good as Atwood. Anyone?
Not that I know of.
So my idea, which is that a game, and I know that the games that are popular now have multi-billion players on them, and that they're extremely ingenious. And my problem in working this thing out is my limited knowledge of the game world. So that's where I want to put this at the disposal of this group and of people that we might bring in. But there's nothing implausible about what I propose. That an online game could mimic the way that the world is changing, and that the virtual game globe in my fiction turns out to be a more accurate prediction or record of what is happening in the ecological sphere than what the scientists are doing. And so the game begins to get a certain respectability, and scientists sneak in their information, and it gets posted on the game globe. And so the reality and what's happening on the game begin to interact.
Richard, have you programmed into your thinking the ways in which the CIA, et cetera, attack the game itself and fuck up its program?
No.
Something we have to think about.
You're absolutely right.
Why, you're not blaming the Russians for it?
It'll be a consortium, David.
Look, you know, the Democratic Party, it's so transparent how they're using Russiagate. And I'm not claiming that Russiagate has no content. And I think the biggest content is probably his corrupt deals with the oligarchs, with Russian oligarchs. But the use of Russiagate to obscure the real issues of what happened in the 2016 election.
Right.
And why the Democratic Party leadership refuses to confront why Trump was selected, because of a white supremacist electoral college and racist voter suppression. And they refuse to confront this. And unfortunately, it may have consequences in 2018 election too. At least the voter suppression part. It's telling, because it's McAuliffe. I wrote a little piece for Portside in this. And McAuliffe, governor of Virginia, actually said why. He laid out the reason. Because it would embarrass the United States in the rest of the world to admit that there are deep flaws in our democratic process, in our electoral system. He actually said that in response to Trump's claims of voter fraud, which of course were fraudulent in themselves. But he said the bad thing about Trump's claims of voter fraud is that it delegitimizes our elections in the eyes of the world. Now, if this is not connected to the agenda of regime change, like in Latin America, come on. And we need to recognize these connections. And you just triggered my little diatribe, Richard. Thank you.
Well, I'll go along, as I always do, by killing you with kindness, because I love you and because you're 95% right. And I would like to take your point one further, okay? If you read what I published on fake news, the biggest scandal of the election is this. And I thank the Russians or WikiLeaks or whoever did it. I'm for every leaker in the world, because all leakers do is let the truth come out, which it ought to. But the Democratic Party rigged the election to prevent the contender who had the most enthusiasm, which was Bernie Sanders, from getting any play at all. They undermined him everywhere. The media focused on when Trump didn't show up, they had a whole air hangar of people waiting for him. And meanwhile, a few hundred miles away, Bernie was talking to 10,000 cheering people, and they never paid any attention to any of his mass meetings. So the big fraud, the thing that ought to have been the scandal, was that the election was stolen then. And I still maintain that if people in West Virginia voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary and then voted for Trump, they weren't completely crazy, because they were deprived of their chance to say fuck you to the system. So they said it the only way that they knew how. And that is a very interesting paradox about the working class in America. And I'm not surprised that it's in West Virginia and all these other red states where labor activism, freed from the stranglehold of the fucking Democratic Party over the fucking union movement, it has allowed the working class to engage in class struggle. And I don't think that Mitch is right when he puts down the working class because they got pulled along by the Communist Party in '68 or any other time, because we need to have freedom and openness and the ability to reach out to each other. And it turns out that Facebook, with all of its horrible faults, allowed the teachers of West Virginia to get together. So there.
Okay. So there. It's almost 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. So does anyone have any parting comments, or should we just wrap it up and see you in 2 weeks?
Somebody's waving a hand.
Sam is waving goodbye, it looks like.
Oh, goodbye. All right. Next time we're going to do the wave of revolutions of around 1979. Yes?
Yeah, and I would add to that if we could also include some consideration of the so-called pink tide in Latin America that followed that at some distance. But the 2000s in Latin America, I have some pretty good analysis that I can post. Not that I wrote, but that some other folks have written in recent drawing a balance sheet and trying to figure out, you know, if it's completely sidetracked or if there's a second wave coming, and, you know, the right-wing counteroffensive in Brazil and Argentina, and the shortcomings of the Venezuelan regime, and so on. So I think we can talk about both of those things next time.
Would it be possible to bring some people from Latin America into the discussion?
Well, that would be great. We've our friend Gerardo Renique from Peru and now in Mexico is somebody we've tried to draw in several times, but we should keep looking.
Do you know Herramienta magazine in Argentina?
What?
It's the Marxist magazine.
Can you type it into the chat? I didn't get the name.
Yeah. It's in English. It's tool. Herramienta.
If somebody will email me something, I can email to her. One of the people helping me write my book is from Argentina, a woman named Deanna Rossi, who was one of the authors of my thing on dignity denied.
Great.
I can send information also to some contacts in Brazil, because now there is a growing movement there.
Yes, yes.
That would be great, Alexei.
And
Alexei, maybe we'll move the capital of the workers' movement back to Moscow, since you were the one that sent me to South Africa and now to Brazil.
and Argentina. Yeah, okay. All sounds good. So we'll see you in 2 weeks, everyone. And meanwhile, see you online.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.